You know what finally broke me? It was a garden bench, white oak, mortise and tenon, good tight joinery. I finished it on a Saturday, glued every joint with exterior-rated polyurethane glue, drove stainless steel screws into every connection, and set it out on the patio feeling pretty proud of myself. 14 months later, the backrest was wobbling. The glue lines had cracked. 2 of the screws had split the grain as the wood moved through the seasons. I had done everything right according to every modern woodworking book I own, and the thing was falling apart in just over a year. Then, about 3 years ago, I visited a maritime heritage yard up in Essex, Massachusetts. The place has been building and restoring wooden boats for over a century, and I watched a shipwright take a dry locust peg about 3/4 of an inch in diameter, set it against a hole bored in a green oak timber, and drive it home with about 6 swings of a mallet. No glue, no screws, no clamps. He just walked away and started on the next one. I asked him how long that joint would hold. He looked at me like I had asked a strange question and said, "Longer than you and me both." That one moment changed how I think about fastening wood. Today, I am going to walk you through exactly how that joint works, why it replaces nails, screws, glue, and clamps all at once, and how you can start using it in your own shop. Plus, stick around to the end because I learned a trick involving hot linseed oil that makes driving these pegs easier and seals them permanently at the same time. Let me show you what I found. What I am talking about is called a trunnel, that is short for tree nail. It is one of the oldest fastening methods in woodworking, and for outdoor and marine applications, it is still one of the best. If you have ever struggled with joints that loosen over time, fasteners that corrode, or glue that gives up when moisture gets involved, this is worth your attention. Because the shipwrights who perfected this technique solved all 4 of those problems with a single piece of wood. To really understand why trunnels work, you need to know where they came from and what problem they were built to solve. For centuries, shipbuilders along the coasts of England, Scandinavia, and colonial New England faced a brutal engineering challenge. They were building structures that had to survive constant immersion in saltwater, violent flexion from wave action, and temperature swings that would destroy most modern adhesives. And early on, they tried iron. Iron bolts, iron nails, iron straps. Every single one of them failed. The problem was not just rust, though that was bad enough. Saltwater creates galvanic corrosion, which eats iron from the inside out. But even worse, iron is rigid. It does not move with the wood. So as the hull timbers swelled and shrank through wet and dry cycles, the iron fasteners would slowly loosen, wallowing out their holes until the joint had no holding power left. The shipwrights watched this happen over and over again, and they came to a conclusion that most of us in modern woodworking have completely forgotten. They realized that wood movement is not the enemy, it is the fastener. That single idea is the foundation of everything I'm about to show you. Instead of fighting the fact that wood expands and contracts with moisture, they designed a joint that uses that movement to lock itself tighter over time. They picked a dense, dry hardwood peg and drove it into a wetter, softer timber. As the timber dried, it shrank around the peg. As the peg slowly absorbed ambient moisture, it swelled into every tiny imperfection in the hole. The result was a connection that actually improved with age. No adhesive on earth does that. So let us start with the core principle, because once you understand this, everything else falls into place. The trunnel works because of something called hygroscopic differential. That is a fancy way of saying that 2 pieces of wood at different moisture contents will move in opposite directions as they reach equilibrium. Here is what that means in practice. You take a peg made from black locust that has been dried down to about 8% moisture content. You drive it into a hole bored in white oak that is sitting at around 20 to 25% moisture content, which is typical for green or air-dried timber. Over the following weeks, 2 things happen simultaneously. The oak begins to lose moisture and shrink. As it shrinks, the walls of that bored hole tighten around the peg like a fist closing. At the same time, the locust peg begins to absorb a small amount of moisture from the surrounding wood and from the air. As it absorbs that moisture, it swells outward, pressing harder against the walls of the hole. You end up with a joint where both pieces of wood are actively pushing against each other. The timber is squeezing inward, the peg is pushing outward, and the more time passes, the tighter it gets. Compare that to a modern polyurethane glue joint on an outdoor project. That glue reaches maximum strength in about 24 hours, and from that moment on, every freeze-thaw cycle, every rainstorm, every blast of summer sun is working to break it down. The trunnel is doing the exact opposite. Time and weather are making it stronger. Now that you understand why it works, let us talk about what kind of wood you need. This is where a lot of people go wrong when they first try trunnels, because they reach for whatever dowel stock they have on hand, and that is almost always the wrong choice. The gold standard for trunnel stock is black locust. There is a reason the old shipwrights swore by it. Black locust is one of the hardest, most rot-resistant domestic hardwoods in North America. It has a Janka hardness of around 1,700, which puts it well above white oak and even hard maple. It is naturally resistant to decay and insect damage without any chemical treatment, and it grows with a straight, tight grain that splits cleanly and predictably. If you cannot find black locust, white oak is your next best option. It has good rot resistance thanks to its tyloses, which are cellular structures that block moisture penetration. But it is softer than locust, so the mechanical lock will not be quite as aggressive. What you want to avoid is any softwood: pine, cedar, spruce, fir. None of these have the density or hardness to create the compression fit you need. And stay away from red oak. I know it looks similar to white oak, but red oak lacks those tyloses. It soaks up water like a sponge, and it will rot in an outdoor application within a few seasons. Here is something critical about preparing your trunnel stock. You want to reeve your blanks, not saw them. Riving means splitting the wood along its natural grain lines using a froe or even a hatchet. When you saw through a piece of locust, the blade cuts across grain fibers indiscriminately. But when you rive it, the split follows the grain perfectly, leaving every fiber intact and running the full length of the peg. That unbroken grain is what gives the trunnel its tremendous shear strength. A riven locust peg is dramatically stronger than a sawn dowel of the same diameter. Once you have riven your blanks, you want them dried down to somewhere between 6 and 10% moisture content. Kiln dried is actually perfect for this application, which surprises a lot of people who associate traditional techniques with air drying only. You want those pegs as dry as you can reasonably get them, so there is maximum room for them to swell once they are driven. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now we get to the part that really separates the trunnel from a regular dowel joint, and that is how you bore the hole and set up what is called a drawbore offset. This is where the engineering gets clever. First, the boring. Traditional shipwrights used shell augers or spoon bits, and you can still find quality versions of these from specialty tool makers. But a standard brad point bit or a Forstner bit works perfectly well for this in a modern shop. The key is the diameter relationship between the hole and the peg. You want the hole to be approximately 1/32 of an inch smaller than the finished diameter of your peg. So if your trunnel is 3/4 of an inch in diameter, you bore a hole at 23/32 of an inch. That interference fit is what creates the initial compression when you drive the peg home, and it is what holds everything tight while the long-term moisture exchange does its work. Now here is where it gets really interesting. The drawbore offset. This is the technique that eliminates your need for clamps entirely, and once you understand it, you will wonder why it is not taught in every woodworking class in the country. Say you are joining a tenon into a mortise. You bore your peg hole through the cheeks of the mortise first, with the tenon removed. Then you insert the tenon, and you mark where the hole appears on the face of the tenon. Now here is the critical step. When you bore the hole through the tenon, you offset it toward the tenon's shoulder by 1/16 of an inch, just 1/16. When you drive the trunnel through all 3 layers, the offset forces the tenon to pull tight against the shoulder of the mortise. The peg literally draws the joint closed as it passes through. That is your clamp. That is your mechanical pull. And unlike a clamp that you remove after the glue dries, this pull is permanent. It is locked in place by the peg itself. One important note: do not get aggressive with that offset. 1/16 of an inch is enough. If you go much beyond that, you risk shearing the peg as it tries to bend through the misaligned holes. I learned that the hard way on my second attempt when I got ambitious and tried an 1/8 of an inch offset. The peg snapped below the surface, and I had to drill it out and start over. With your hole bored and your offset marked, it is time to shape and drive the peg. The old shipwrights had a process for this that was simple and efficient, and I have adopted it almost exactly as they did it. Start with your riven blank, which at this point is roughly square in cross-section. Take a draw knife or a block plane and knock the corners off to create an octagon. Then use a dowel plate, which is just a thick steel plate with graduated holes in it, to drive the octagonal blank through the correct diameter hole. What comes out the other side is a round peg with burnished compressed fibers on the surface. That compression actually helps the peg drive more smoothly and creates an even tighter fit once the fibers spring back inside the hole. Before driving, chamfer the lead end of the peg with a sharp chisel or knife. You want a gentle taper on the first 1/4 inch or so. This guides the peg into the hole without catching on the rim and splitting the surrounding timber. For driving, use a wooden mallet or a dead blow hammer, never a steel hammer. Steel will mushroom the head of the peg, splitting and crushing the fibers you need intact. A smooth-faced wooden mallet transfers energy cleanly without damaging the peg. Drive with firm, confident strokes. You will feel the resistance increase as the peg enters the interference fit zone, and you will hear the tone change from a hollow thud to a solid, ringing knock. That tonal shift is your signal that the peg is seating properly. When the sound goes dead and the peg stops moving, it is home. I will never forget driving my first real trunnel. It was a 3/4 inch locust peg into a green oak knee brace for a garden pergola. When I felt that peg seat and heard that tone change, and I grabbed the joint and tried to move it and nothing budged, I stood there thinking about all the clamps and glue and screws I had used on that bench 3 years earlier. And this one peg, this one piece of wood, was doing all of their jobs at once. Now, let me show you one more technique the shipwrights used that takes this joint from excellent to nearly indestructible. It is called a fox wedge, and it is used when you are driving a trunnel into a blind hole, meaning a hole that does not go all the way through. Before you drive the peg, you take a thin wedge of the same hardwood, about 1 inch long, and maybe 1/8 of an inch wide at its thickest point. You cut a shallow kerf into the far end of your peg, about 3/4 of an inch deep. You insert the wedge into that kerf, so it is just sitting there loosely. Now, when you drive the peg into the blind hole, the wedge hits the bottom of the hole first and has nowhere to go. As you continue driving the peg forward, the wedge is forced deeper into the kerf, which spreads the end of the peg outward inside the hole. The peg essentially mushrooms at the far end, creating a mechanical dovetail inside the timber. You could not pull that peg out if you tried. It is locked in 3 dimensions. This technique is what the shipwrights used below the waterline, where failure meant the ocean coming in. If it held against the Atlantic, it will hold against whatever your project faces. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for glue on every outdoor joint. Most of us do this because glue is what we were taught equals strength, but every exterior adhesive has a lifespan. Epoxy gets brittle. Polyurethane breaks down under sustained UV exposure. The trunnel does not care about any of that because there is no adhesive to degrade. The second pattern is using softwood dowels for pegged joints. I see this constantly. People buy birch or poplar dowel rod from the hardware store and assume it will work. It will not. Those dowels are sawn, not riven, so the grain is already compromised, and they lack the density to create a real interference fit. You need hardwood and you need it riven. The third pattern is drilling the hole too large. People are afraid of splitting the timber, so they drill the hole the same size as the peg, or even slightly larger. That eliminates the entire compression mechanism. You need that 1/32 of an inch of interference. Trust the wood. If your timber is sound and your peg is chamfered properly, it will not split. The fourth pattern is skipping the drawbore offset. People drive the peg straight through with no offset and then wonder why the tenon shoulder does not seat tight. That 1/16 of an inch offset is doing the work of every clamp in your shop. Do not skip it. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This one came directly from a shipwright who had been building wooden boats for over 40 years, and I have never seen it in any woodworking book. Before driving your trunnel, heat up some raw linseed oil until it is warm to the touch, not boiling, just warm, maybe around 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Dip the last 2 inches of the peg's lead end into the warm oil and let it soak for about 30 seconds. The warm oil penetrates the end grain quickly and deeply because heat thins the oil and opens the wood's pore structure. When you drive that peg, the oil serves 2 purposes. First, it lubricates the entry, letting the peg slide into the interference fit without grabbing and stalling prematurely. You get a cleaner, more complete seating. Second, as the linseed oil cures over the following weeks, it polymerizes inside the wood fibers, effectively sealing the peg from the inside out. It becomes its own waterproofing treatment, locked right into the joint where you need it most. I have been doing this for about 2 years now on every outdoor trunnel I drive, and the difference in both the driving feel and the long-term performance is remarkable. It is one of those small, quiet tricks that separates centuries of accumulated wisdom from what you find in a modern catalog. If this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. I have been woodworking for a long time, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that learning the trunnel changed how I think about building things. One piece of wood, properly selected, properly dried, properly driven, doing the job of 4 different modern products. The old shipwrights figured this out centuries ago. All we have to do is pay attention. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.